Afternoon all. Thank you for taking some time out of what I'm guessing are very busy schedules for all of you. What we want to do this afternoon for the next 90 minutes is to go through some of the key guidance that the Mental Welfare Commission produces. So we've got three for you, and what we intend to do is to give a synopsis and an overview of them. It can be difficult finding your way and navigating your way through them. So we've picked three of the ones that are most likely to have implications around about restrictive practice and the rights that we want you to be considering when that happens. What we intend to do is there'll be myself, Claire Lamsam first up, and then it's followed by Denise, and then it's followed by Paul. And I'm going to march right on because time is of the essence. So today I'm going to cover rights, risks and limits to freedom. As in all of our guidance, it doesn't give definitive answers. It aims to guide you in the way that you think about situations, clinical, environmental, information that you would want to hand on to individuals that are in your care or their families or relatives. So it's not all encompassing, but it hopefully gives you enough of a clear steer on what should be in place as you embark on decisions that are around about, for this one, restricting, and particularly around about restraint to the extent that might be required. And I've started with it in bright pink Commission colours. We believe that restraint should absolutely be the last resort. When there is no alternative that you can consider, and when there isn't, and when it can't be reduced to an acceptable level of looking at an identified or specific risk, at that point, we would consider that restraint could be the option that you might use. And I'll talk a little bit later about how the minimum standards of restraint. But we know that the area around about risk is usually the driving factor for when the intervention is used. When restraint is being considered, whether it's in the planned way or an unplanned way, whether it's done deliberately or unintentionally, it's the actions of the care staff intending to prevent and put limits on that individual so that they can manage the risk better. Some of the experience we have at the Commission when we do visits or when we're asked for advice on it is the issue around about the justification of using restraint. And what we're hoping today to do is to talk you through how you might really think about that in a more contemplative, formal way and put in place the measures that would be required to do that. When you're using restraint, there's degrees of control that people have. There's including their individual views of them as well as their family and relatives. But it's the intention and the purpose behind the use of restraint that we're ideally wanting people to think about through this guidance. We appreciate that restraint is not entirely 100% unavoidable in any situations. So the idea here is that when this restrictive practice occurs, when it's being considered and it's being planned for, and there's an intervention that sits alongside it, at that point it's to understand that there are obviously different ways of doing the actual intervention itself. So the first one, in terms of what you're doing, is you're directly interfering with someone's body movements. At that point, you're doing it either by the physical presence of another member of staff, or it can be done by mechanical means. And I'll talk a little bit later on about what those mechanical means can be, but it's in any way that you're possibly trying to present and create a barrier to the movement of that individual, primarily with the consideration that, as I've said, there's a risk that you've perceived with the individual's actions, their behaviours, their ability to make decisions that might harm themselves or harm others. And at that point, having hopefully gone through as many other options as you can, and you're looking at this as being potentially the last one that's available to you, at that point, different ways of providing the barriers that set up, whether it's someone creating a barrier through the door, someone creating it through observation. The things that are coming more available now in certain environments are high intensity suites, where there's a two-way mirror of ensuring that somebody is in a situation where restraint is happening, albeit not hands-on, but that restrictive element of how you're managing someone's actions and behaviours in that process has to be considered as being the physical environment and what's been put in place. There are other softer ways that we observe regularly when we're out on visits or that we hear about or concerns that are brought to our attention. And these are the ones that we term as might be around about verbal communication when someone's maybe it's indicating something would happen to an individual if they don't settle, if they continue to behave in a stressed and distressed way. So that implication that there would be restrictions put upon an individual can be done in a way that we would absolutely consider restraint as moving in that direction. And the mental health law review talks about coercion, and it's very early doors, I think, in terms of getting people to understand where that sits. But that idea that it comes through verbal communication, psychological influences that might be part and parcel of what someone is experiencing as a result of being advised that if they don't demonstrate a change in their behaviour, then this will be put in place. And obviously behavioural controls that can happen in an environment, locked doors, people moved away from other individuals in the unit, situations where they are contained by staff sitting either side of them, or light touches. So there's different ways when restraint starts to happen without it going into the full hands-on. And it's to be mindful that those are just as much on that scale of restraint being applied as other situations. I wanted to flag up the financial and the social restrictions that come around with restraint, because again, it's this element of controlling someone's behaviour in a way that takes the ability for them to have the freedom and choice that they would have because you've deemed it, or it's been deemed that they don't have capacity, or their capacity is so diminished by whatever they're experiencing that at this point, the control has to sit with the service or the setting. And as we'll go on and talk a little bit about with the specified persons, but there are clear parameters, there is clear legislation that if you're using this level of control, whether it's financial and whether you'll use adults with incapacity or appointeeship, using the legislation to ensure that those restrictions are lawfully done is essential. Guidance goes on to be very definitive about the types of restraint. And the first one is the one that we're probably all most familiar with, which is direct. Physically laying hands on someone to prevent them engaging in some movement or a behaviour or a reaction. And that, for the majority of staff who are involved in that, there would be an expectation that some formal training or understanding of what they're doing is required. And I'll talk a little bit about what the service has to have in place for this too. When direct restraint, as in hands-on, is required, at that point there must be clarity in the policies that are in place. There must be clear monitoring around about what's being done to the individual as a result of the direct intervention of staff at that point in time. And what we absolutely advise at this is that any care plan that's put in place has to be for the benefit of the individual and the staff. It has to be prescriptive, it has to be person-centred, it has to have the bit as well around about the views of the individual and any relatives or carers that might be involved if there's an advocate. Gathering all of that information and intelligence before a direct hands-on restraint is advised. I've put on there that mechanical restraint, when we're considering that, would be the use of chairs. It would also be the use of the trays that we see often when we visit an individual in a care home and who may be under a guardianship. Belts, we often give advice on lap belts that are put in place, and why they're put in place, because they are restrictive and they're another form of restraint. Limb restrictions for some individuals that need it in terms of harm, they're quite rare and they're quite unusual, but it still should be factored in, and it still should be care planned, and it still should be very prescriptively monitored, evaluated and reviewed. But other ones that come up in the guidance, we talk about cot size and the restrictiveness of those, albeit with the intention of supporting someone. But cot size can be an issue, and vehicles, when someone's going out in a vehicle, particularly someone who may be part and parcel of service. If there's particular parts in the vehicle that's used, they need to be again care planned for, monitored and evaluated. One of the ones that we're asked about most often is the use of locked doors. And when I talk about settings, I don't just mean health settings. This can happen very often in an individual's home where there are locked doors to either their room or a kitchen. But in in the mainstream services in terms of health, the locking of doors has now become more of it's part and parcel of what's expected. And we understand that for the requirements of safety, there are times during the day, particularly evening times, where it might be better to have the environment and a locked door. But at that point, you're restricting everyone in that environment, and it's consideration. We'll talk about it more in the specified person ones, but the blanket approach to this level of restriction has to be considered restraining. And that idea for someone where that it's a locked door to let them in and out can be mitigated against. So for a lot of you, it's thinking about, if I'm locking a door, what will that mean? Technology has improved, as we all know well, our Android and our iPhones and all the things that brings. And to some extent, today's been great because we can do it this way. But the flip side of that is, as technology has improved, so have the opportunities to put in restrictive practice that restrain individuals. And we've seen in some of the areas that we go into the increasing use of digital technology, particularly around about CCTV. And there's a lot of consideration around about where that can be placed. We hear more and more often people contacting us saying, this individual's in this setting, can we use CCTV for this particular? We always advise at that point, again, around about the legislative framework that should be in place to do that. And as comes back with the standard that we would expect when you're creating a situation where restraints in place, it's the standards, it's the assessment of it, it's the evaluation of it, and the ongoing monitoring. So it's the bit thinking ahead around about access to smartphones that go, or smart system monitoring in the home, GPS trackers. We've had one of them recently where individuals have been given that, and it's been part and parcel of a restrictive plan where the individual wasn't particularly happy. So it's to be mindful that as technology moves ahead, that still has to be factored in as a restrictive practice that needs to be set within guidance, so that there are safeguards, so that it's lawful. Medication can also be used in this way. The use of sedatives and tranquilizers when we go out and we do visits, or people contact us and say that this has been prescribed for someone, a relative or a family member. Is this appropriate? Is it relevant? It can be in a short term, but it can't be used if we're using it against stress and distress behaviours. It can be used if the symptomology allows it to be so, but not for restricting someone who at that way could be dealt with. Their concerns, their actions could be dealt with in a more responsive and a less restrictive way. And the indirect use of restraint can't be forgotten about in this part. Part of the things that I talked about was that often we think about how busy staff are these days, but one of the things in an indirect way, if somebody is really unhappy and distressed in the environment they're in, or they're in their bed, or they want to move from one place to another and they can't get staff and they can't move, they're restrained. There's no other way around about it. They are in an environment where they can't be supported to move to something else. If somebody is on one floor and they have to access a lift to get to another one, that could be considered restraint. And it's thinking about those alongside when you've got staff that are really busy and trying to kind of around about it, and they're brusque in their attitude, or they're maybe not as helpful as they would be. Those are all indirect use of restraint, because they stop people and they limit that freedom that they have to move or get their needs met.